Hi everybody. Right now we're going to go over a few facts about the radio chapter. Oh, let me turn my phone off. 232 million people every day listen to the radio, and what I want to talk about in class is how relevant radio actually is to you. And when I talk about radio in this chapter, I'm talking about terrestrial radio stations that you might listen to in your car, something like that. I'm not talking about Pandora or Spotify or any of the streaming services. We're talking about terrestrial radio. Is radio still necessary? In what conditions? At what point is radio necessary? These are things I want you to start thinking about so we can talk about in class. Your books spend a lot of time talking about the telegraph, which I think is interesting, but telegraph was private communication between individuals. Radio was the first time information was electronically broadcast to a larger audience. All right, so let's start with the very basics. James Maxwell was a physicist from Scotland who discovered this. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. If you notice, there's a lot of terms on here that you're probably familiar with, but if you see the actual portion there where it says visible, that is the only part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can see with our own eyes. But look at the space of radio waves there that are accessible. Okay, we can't see them, but they're there. So James Maxwell thought, hey, we should harness those invisible waves to see if we can transmit messages. So Marconi, in most cases, is credited with inventing the actual radio. He took the radio waves and figured out a way to transmit Morse code on them. His idea of the radio was kind of a cordless telegraph. He only viewed it as a one-to-one communication. He received a patent for that. But remember, Marconi only thought of radio as one-to-one wireless communication, kind of like a walkie-talkie with Morse code, okay? The person who's credited with turning radio into what it is now is a man named Edwin De Forest. What he did was include music and voice in the radio waves, not just Morse code, and he viewed it as a way to transmit from one person to many. He was also very modest. He called himself the father of radio. Yeah. Modest guy. So Marconi only transmitted Morse code to one person. Edwin De Forest made radio what it was now. Music and voice to a large audience. What's interesting about this is that the first people to have radios in their homes were actually scared when they heard voices because they thought their houses were haunted. It sounds weird to us now because, you know, we're such savvy media consumers, but back then, think of how weird it would have been to hear someone else's voice in your house. They thought their houses were haunted. Okay, so broadcasting is born. Now we have a way to electronically communicate to a large audience at once. And broadcasting actually used to be a farming term. It meant when you threw seeds to the widest area possible. Okay? So we've got a new medium, and what does the government want to do? Regulate it, of course. So they started with a Wireless Ship Act in 1910 stating that every American ship needed to have a radio on board. But the Radio Act of 1912 is something that you need to remember because what that required was a license to operate. Basically, that means that if Z107 in St. Louis is going to take up 107.7 on the FM dial, no other stations can take up that spot in our market because they have the license for that frequency. The reason that they required licenses was to make sure that the waves weren't getting too crowded, because if you had two stations trying to broadcast on the same frequency, it wouldn't work. Okay? Also, the Radio Act of 1912 said that radio waves could not be owned, which is kind of ironic because they claim that we, the people, own the radio waves, that we own the electromagnetic spectrum. But if you run a radio station, you do not own the airwaves. You only own a license to operate within that frequency. You with me? A little bit of trivia. During World War I, the government required that all local radio operators cease operation. This would include ham radio operators or local operators, mainly because they were worried that the Germans would be able to listen in and somehow find out really exciting things. I don't think that would ever work now if the government tried to shut down any form of media, but it has happened in the past. All right, so it took until 1922 for a station to figure out that they should sell advertising time. The first station to do that was WNBC in New York City. They charged $50 for an ad. The public outrage was crazy. I guess people just assumed that radio was a public service and that people did it just to be nice. Well, we know that that's not true. There's an enormous amount of money to be made. And WNBC was the first one. So people have gotten used to radio commercials. You know, we talk in class about annoying radio commercials and how they bug us. But really, the more annoying a radio commercial is, the better by definition, because you remember it. It's crazy. Okay, David Sarnoff was probably the most important person besides Marconi and De Forest in the development of the radio. He was Marconi's message boy when he was 15. This is an early picture of David Sarnoff. He had vision. The way that Bill Gates had vision for the personal computer, David Sarnoff had vision for the radio. Because if you read this quote from him when he was 24, it sounds exactly like what Bill Gates was saying about the personal computer. So he saw it as a way to bring media into everybody's home. He went on to create a little company called the National Broadcasting Company, which we all know as NBC. He also had the brilliant idea of working with General Motors to make sure that every car that General Motors created had a radio. Now, my dad is an older gentleman, and he tells the story about when radios became common in cars. People would drive around with their windows down so that everyone they passed would know that they had a radio in their car. It was a very big deal to have a radio in your car. And now, primarily, that's where most of us do our radio listening, is in the car, if we listen at all. Okay, so the Radio Act of 1912 said that you had to have a license to operate, right? The Radio Act of 1927 took that one step further and said not only do you have to have a license to operate, but you have to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That's kind of vague, isn't it? Yeah, the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Now, if you've ever been listening to the radio and you've heard the emergency broadcast system, testing, things like that, these are some of the things that radio stations have to do to maintain their licenses. But the public interest, convenience, and necessity is an interesting phrase because there are a lot of different ways that one could interpret that. But remember, the Radio Act of 1927 also reiterated the fact that radio stations did not own the airwaves, only the licenses to operate within them, okay? So the golden age of radio, according to your books, was the 1930s and 40s. Why? Well, of course, radio had no competition. And radio then was, oh, you can see one of my friends is on Skype. Radio then was a primary medium to consume. And what I mean by primary is that then, when you were listening to the radio, you were doing nothing else. You were sitting next to a thing the size of a refrigerator that was actually the radio, and you sat and you listened. Now, typically, radio is a secondary activity for us, meaning that we're doing something else while we're listening to the radio, like driving or cooking, things like that. In class, I have asked who this person is, and I've had people not know, and it makes me cry. This is Franklin Roosevelt. He was a genius when it came to working with new media of his time. So he would have radio chats every afternoon, or radio broadcasts every Saturday. Sorry, not every afternoon. And he called them fireside chats. Do you know how brilliant that is? Think of the connotative difference between saying a speech by the president and a fireside chat. Which one makes the president sound more accessible and homey? And which one sounds more inviting? The fireside chat. And Roosevelt's voice, in most cases, was the first time Americans actually heard what their president sounded like. So it was a very big deal, and he was very, very smart to use the radio medium like he did. You can't talk about the history of the radio without talking about Orson Welles and what he did on Halloween night, 1938. I know you've heard the phrase War of the Worlds. What this was a dramatic radio presentation of a Martian invasion. Couple problems with it, though. It was broadcast on the CBS network in New York. It used sirens and background noises and special effects sounds that people weren't used to, so they assumed that they were real. Okay? Also, at the beginning of the broadcast, they mentioned that this is just a dramatic, recreation of a possible event, blah, blah, blah. Well, how often do you turn into a program after it's already started? The disclaimer about War of the Worlds broadcast being fake only happened at the beginning. So people were tuning into this thinking that it was legit, and it scared the heck out of people. Many people were walking through New York carrying rifles. Some of them would wear wet towels around their head to protect them from the laser beams. Okay, this is where the tinfoil hat people came from. It was from the War of the Worlds broadcast. So the main thing about the War of the Worlds broadcast was it was the first time that Americans were fooled with mass media. Like we watch Punk'd, we watch The Onion, and we read The Onion like crazy. We're very used to being punked with the media, right? People back then weren't, and it was difficult for some. Okay, so War of the Worlds. Transistors didn't come until 1947. That made music and radio portable. It was a very big deal to have portable music. Edwin Armstrong actually decided that FM waves were the future of radio, not AM. He set up the first FM antenna on the roof of the Empire State Building. But he had long legal battles with David Sarnoff, and he eventually committed suicide. It's a very, very sad story, but it actually, turned out to be correct, that FM radio was going to have a more profitable future than AM. That's why Edwin Armstrong is mentioned in radio chapters. So the actual difference between AM waves and FM waves is demonstrated here. If you see the AM, which stands for amplitude modulated, is pretty high. Okay, there's a good range of waves in AM waves. The FM waves, the frequently modulated waves, are tighter together and they're uniform. What that means essentially for us non-physicists is that AM waves travel farther. FM waves sound better. And we all know this. The AM stations last longer when you're driving. The FM stations sound better. This isn't really news. All right, so let's talk about radio station programming. And you're all familiar with this too. It's all done in blocks. You've got the 6 to 10, 10 to 3, 3 to 7, and 7 to midnight. Then the overnight crowd, where typically you have a DJ that doesn't really play any commercials and can play whatever they want. Right? You can't do that during the drive time blocks, which are the 6 to 10 and 3 to 7. Those are the big blocks where they make the most money for their advertising. That's also when there are a lot of news, weather, and traffic interruptions. If you end up working in radio, you want to be in one of the drive blocks because you get the highest ratings that way. I think you know that already. The top formats in radio might surprise you. Most people think that the adult contemporary format is actually the most popular, but it's not. It's actually news and talk. Who knew? Okay. So in St. Louis, news and talk would be 97.1 or KMOX, AM 1120. Adult contemporary would probably be Y98 at 98.1. Contemporary hit radio, the top 40 would be Z1077, who has like 5 songs and they just play them over and over and over and over again. Interesting that Spanish is number 6, and I think that will probably increase. But when we talk about the top format for American radio, don't say adult contemporary. It's news talk, okay? Don't forget. Don't forget. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 is a piece of legislation that we're actually going to talk about every week this semester. I know. But it's cool. And here's why. It lifted restrictions on how many radio stations one company could own. There used to be restrictions on that. Well, why? Why do you think there were restrictions? Well, to maintain a good variety and diversity of media ownership, right? Well, now that restriction was lifted. So a company could have as many radio stations as they wanted. So now there aren't as many companies that own radio stations. So now we're all getting the same stuff. What's interesting about this piece of legislation is that it comes into play in almost every form of media that we're going to talk about this semester. Signed by Bill Clinton, 1996. Okay, some terms you need to know. What does it mean if a radio show is syndicated? You've heard the term. What it means in radio is that it is recorded or done in one city, but sold to many others. Okay, so Tom Joyner, Rush, Ryan Seacrest have the 3 most popular syndicated radio shows in the country. What that means is that Ryan Seacrest does his radio show in LA, and then that company will sell his program to other radio stations. So I think that Z107 actually does run Ryan Seacrest's show. Why would they do that? What's the advantage? Well, that's 3 hours. They don't have to pay their own person to do a radio show. And Ryan Seacrest already comes with a built-in audience. Same with Tom Joyner and Rush Limbaugh. I mean, think of it. If I'm a radio station owner and I have a chance to have Rush on my show or on my station, I'm going to do it because he has a built-in audience, and that's 4 hours that I don't have to come up with programming for my station. So it's a win-win for me. Syndicated radio shows where the money is. If you want to get in radio, because there's such a movement towards automation of music, if you want to get in radio, I think syndication is really where the future is. There's a term called lost localism related to radio. And I want you to be familiar with that because I think it's a real issue, and it all goes back to the Telecommunications Act of 1996. What that means essentially is that there are no local radio stations anymore. There's a great story, well, it's kind of a sad story actually, but a great example of lost localism when a train in North Dakota derailed. It was one of those states up there, derailed, and they needed to evacuate the town. So they called the radio stations so that they could break into programming and tell people that they needed to evacuate. Well, they kept calling all the radio stations and no one was answering because all the programming was done in New York by computer. So there are very few humans behind the microphone anymore, and if there are, they're usually not in your little town. So there's not a local flavor. In fact, every genre of radio station that we have here is matched in every city in the country. There's no variety. There's no regional music. It's all the radio has really become a national thing now because of lost localism and because of syndication. So to demonstrate this, I put together a slide of the stations in St. Louis owned by Clear Channel. Okay, so Clear Channel is a company that owns all of these radio stations. And MS is the company that owns all of these radio stations. And here's CBS and the stations that they own in St. Louis and the stations that Bonneville Corporation owns in St. Louis. The point of this is that none of these companies are based in St. Louis. So none of these radio stations are actually local. Now, KMOX will tell you that they're local because most of their programming, although not all, most of their programming originates in St. Louis. And there's something interesting about KMOX also. They refer to themselves as a 50,000 watt clear channel station. That doesn't mean they're owned by the company called Clear Channel. What that means is that there is no other station in North America that has the license to operate at 1120 on the AM dial. That is why on a clear summer night, people in Canada can hear Cardinal games, because there's no other station in North America broadcasting on that frequency except for KMOX, and they have 50,000 watts. So when people talk about Cardinal Nation, that's really why, because people all through the Midwest can listen to Cardinal games on KMOX. All right. National Public Radio is very different. If you're not familiar with it, get familiar with it. Here's why. 2 reasons. National Public Radio is funded by tax money through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by donations, which means that they don't have to worry about their ratings, so they don't have to worry about selling ads. Now, if you don't have to worry about selling ads and you don't have to worry about your ratings, you don't have to play Ryan Seacrest. You don't have to have weather and traffic every 10 minutes. You can spend a long time on stories that you think are important. So the average news story on NPR is something like 7 minutes long. It's crazy. The tone of NPR is very relaxed. It's a slower pace. compared to the almost frenetic commercial radio stations. I'd encourage you to listen. It's 90.7 in St. Louis. If you've never listened to NPR before, give it a shot. It has been accused of liberal bias in the past, but hasn't everybody. Every time I listen to NPR, I learn something. It's just interesting. So give it a try. All right, some trends in radio. Well, we've talked about this. Music streaming, Pandora, Spotify. Like, why would I listen to a radio station that someone else is choosing, someone else is telling me what to listen to, when I can listen to Spotify or Pandora and give immediate feedback and choose what I want to hear? Or why would I listen to terrestrial radio in my car when I can plug in the iPod and listen to songs that I have chosen? Okay? Regular terrestrial radio faces heavy competition. And not just from these streaming services, but also from satellite radio. I'm not sure that I'd want to be in the radio business right now. But, of course, here we go. It's the communication model. You're going to see this all semester. Aren't you excited? With the streaming services, you are both the sender and the receiver of the message. It gives you power. You have choice. You have control. And with regular terrestrial radio, we are just the receivers. And someone else is choosing what we are to listen to. Which brings me to a question that I want to bring up in class. Does the radio industry give us what we want, or do we have songs pushed down our throat? Are songs popular because they're on the radio, or are they on the radio because they're popular? What kind of business relationships exist between huge radio conglomerates and the record companies? I think that makes for a really interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to having it in class with you. Okay? Take care, everybody.